All right, we're live.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to History Valley Podcast. I will be the host and moderator for this evening's event. Did Jesus survive the crucifixion? We have Jacob Berman, who will be taking the negative, versus David Mirsch, who will be taking the affirmative, that Jesus survived the crucifixion. Gentlemen, do we have a set format? And who wants to go first? Is David going to go first? Jacob going to go first? What are we going to
I'm fine with letting David go first.
Okay. David will be taking the affirmative. And did Jesus survive the crucifixion? How long are we going to go for the intro before we actually move on to the debate itself? 10 minutes. Is 10 minutes fine, David?
Yeah, that may be a little bit long. I was actually hoping Jacob would go first so I could
Well,
see the. But
well,
if,
I mean, your position is disputing the widely held belief that Jesus died, so
right.
I was thinking you should go first because of that.
Okay. Okay.
just however long you want, David. 5 minutes, 10 minutes. It's fine.
I'll just go with it, and when
Okay.
I'm done, I'll let you know. I'll turn it over to Jacob.
All righty.
Does that work?
That
Yeah.
works.
Cool. Um, Hi, my name is David Mirsch. I'm the author of a book, The Open Tomb, and I'm here tonight debating with Jacob Berman about whether or not Jesus survived the crucifixion. All of my studies seem to indicate the affirmative, and I think there are a lot of things that scholarly consensus has missed in their research that alters the picture of whether he could have survived or not. And these are historical things that scholars have missed or overlooked or ignored, and they play a fairly big part in the situation with the crucifixion and whether or not Jesus survived. My own contention is that it was a situation of swoon theory. But there are really two formats to that. There's a natural swoon where Jesus may have slipped into kind of a comatose state from loss of blood and the beatings that he took. But as I continue, I'll show that that wasn't the case, that he didn't go through some of those things that we have accepted as, part of the historical record. The other aspect of the swoon theory is that it was based on a conspiracy, that it was a manufactured swoon. This more readily can explain many of the things that we see in the Gospels as far as the crucifixion, the resurrection, and that he actually survived and actually lived to be quite an old man. One of the things that I want to point out is that when you see the new information, I assume it's new. When you see the new information, I think you'll agree that there was every possibility that he could have survived. That the Mel Gibson kind of abuse that he took, and that people have basically agreed with, scholars have agreed with that, wasn't the case. He didn't go through all that stuff. Basically, he was dealt a Mosaic law flogging, which would have been just 39 lashes, and certainly not enough to cause him any great physical harm. Paul mentions that he survived such floggings on numerous occasions, so it is not unreasonable to assume that if that is in fact the case, if that is what Jesus was dealt, he had every possibility of surviving the crucifixion. I have also built a model of what, as far as archaeologically and historically, we can come to terms with, is a model of how Jesus was actually crucified. You'll see this is based on the archaeological evidence of a first century crucified victim, the heel bone and the nail going through the heel bone, to lend some credence to my point of view as to how he was actually crucified and why he was crucified in that manner. And there are other things too. There are things that are historically reported by both the Gospels and Philo and Josephus that lend, some bearing on what I'm saying. I think that's about it, really. Once we get into the meat of it, I'll be able to show, exactly what I'm talking about and how he was crucified and why I think that he survived it. And I'll turn that over to Jacob.
Jacob?
All right, you can go ahead and start your 10-minute timer. The earliest text that we have is Paul's letters. There may have been a Hebrew gospel predating them or not. That's another story, and that doesn't really matter. Paul does not talk about anyone meeting Jesus while after the crucifixion and was still alive. There's no evidence of this from Paul's letters. There's no reference to Jesus being alive still in Paul's day when Paul's writing these letters. I mean, Paul's contemporary. Don't get me wrong. Paul is a contemporary individual with Jesus, but when he's writing these letters, there's no evidence that Jesus was still alive. And he talks about James. There's no mention of Jesus still leading the movement. And when you look at the letters, Paul is arguing with other people about what they believe about Jesus. And nobody's telling him that I went to go talk to Jesus who's still alive to refute Paul. They never say anything like this. And so that would be, in my view, that's a major issue when dealing with the claim that Jesus survived the crucifixion, like anyone trying to profess belief in that, because when you look at Paul's letters, there's just no indication Jesus is alive when Paul's composing these letters, and he's communicating and preaching to the Gentiles and talking to other rival groups that also believe in Jesus, but differently but they differ from his own beliefs in Jesus. And so that's the kind of thing that I find very problematic. And also you've got Hebrew Matthew, which I think did exist in his pre-Pauline. Jerome quotes Hebrew Matthew, and he says that James fasted. He refused to eat. And I think he also refused to drink. Yeah, he was just fasting until the Lord appeared to him. And so he does. And it's an appearance. It's not, he's not supposed to be alive. He's supposed to be dead and rose from the dead. And he was communicating to James. James is basically, this goes with the idea that James is the successor to Jesus. You see the Gospel of Thomas also talking about this when the followers of Jesus go up to Jesus and they ask him, hey, who's going to take your place when you die? James, he says. And there's no indication. Now, the Gospel of Thomas never talks about the crucifixion, mind you, but there's no indication of any plans to crucify and fake his death somehow. It crucify Jesus and fake his death, make it seem like he was dead, and he was not. And so I find that to be extremely problematic. And you look at the Gospel of Mark when it ends with the women just running away from the tomb in Mark 16:8. That's the original ending of it. It was given a longer ending later. To try to harmonize Mark's resurrection account with Luke and Matthew and potentially John's, which was ultimately futile, just made it an even more contradictory mess than it already was when comparing it to the other Gospels. So I find that problematic, and I just don't see how one can work from these texts and think Jesus survived the crucifixion. Especially when looking at Paul and how Paul is just missing pretty much almost everything about the resurrection story. He just says Jesus rose. He doesn't really say much else. And like I said, there's no indication that any of these Christian leaders thought Jesus was still alive. We just don't have evidence of this. And if the crucifixion was faked and it was this massive conspiracy, which there's no evidence of, I don't see any evidence of this. It was a massive conspiracy to fake his death on the cross. Who was involved, and what method did they use to carry that out? And where's the evidence for that? And that being said, I don't know how much time I have left by way of the rest.
4 minutes. Well,
I'll
almost
waive
3
it.
minutes.
I don't need it. I'll waive it.
Okay. All right.
That's what I had to say.
All right. So, um, David, if you want to go ahead and start it off. Again, I'll keep a timer. Try to keep it to about 10 minutes, so we'll say. Unless you guys want to go informal, it's up to you.
I'm happy with informal. That's fine with
Okay.
me.
Okay.
It's okay with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. First, I want to rebut some of the things that Jacob has, is dealing with. In my understanding of Jesus and the Gospels, and Paul's letters, Paul is not a follower of Jesus. Okay, so I don't take his writings very seriously. He was in opposition to Jesus. Jesus was, as is suggested, the Messiah, which means he was a military man. And he was fomenting revolt against the Romans. Now, you have to understand that Paul, originally the Hebrew Saul, was a Roman citizen. He was born in the province of Tarsus, and he wanted to preach to the Gentiles. And he actually changed his name from the Hebrew Saul to the Latin Paul, which is kind of a real key to where he was going. He wasn't going to teach biographical things about Jesus. He did not want to deal with a real human Jesus. He was subverting Jesus's mission, his goals, by talking about a celestial Jesus and preaching things that the other followers of Jesus didn't agree with. So you can see that there's an attempt by Paul to move away from the historical Jesus, the real Jesus, and create this kind of mythic celestial Jesus, because Paul starts out by persecuting the early followers. And then with a magical mystery tour vision, he suddenly switches over to say, no, I saw Jesus, so I'm on board with him. It's a blatant move that persecuting them wasn't working. And what better way to get rid of the Jesus movement than to change it into one of peace and love and harmony. And, that's basically what Paul was trying to do. He, in order to get rid of or kill the Jesus movement, he subverted it and started preaching to the Gentiles, in order to guide more people away from the Jewish view of what Jesus was trying to preach. You can see this a little bit in the Gospels, when some of I think it's the Pharisees and the scribes, condemn Jesus. They say, why are you hanging out with prostitutes and tax collectors? Well, if you're a military leader, those are two of the things you need to do. You go to prostitutes who are maybe getting involved with Roman soldiers to get information about troop dispositions, and you go to the tax collectors to try and interfere with the flow of money to the Roman army. Those are things that we know about in modern times. We see that. It's one, I can't remember the exact title now, but basically spy groups do that all the time. They use prostitutes, or they use honey trap, that's the word, honey traps, to get information from oppositions. Now, to get back to my position, if any of you have ever heard of the book or the movie 127 Hours, it is a story about a rock climber, true story. And the story revolves around the fact that he goes to a canyon in Utah and is hiking and rock climbing. And apparently he slips and dislodges an 800-pound boulder, which traps his arm. And the 127 hours relates to the number of days that he was trapped by that boulder. Nobody came along through that canyon. He was left by himself. And ultimately, he had to cut off his own arm to escape the boulder. After that, he walked for 6 miles until he ran into some people that gave him some help. The reason that story is important is because it shows human nature's desire or attempts to stay alive even in the worst situations. It's kind of the coyote arm deal. You know, if you're trapped, you're going to cut off your arm so that you're not going to die there. And that's pretty much what Romans found out about crucifixion. And maybe, you know, they found out from the Philistines before them. But basically, what you run into, and this is a crucifixion nail. This is about as close as I could get to a crucifixion nail. Crucifixion nail might have been just a little bit longer, and it would have had a second head on it so that they could easily pull it out. But what they found out pretty quickly was that if you crucify somebody like that with just a nail through them, what they will do is they will work that through their hand all the way, and it will free up their hand. So what the Romans had to do was they would put on a piece of olive wood and nail that so that they couldn't do that. So crucified victims could not do that. Now, historically, that's what it looks like. The smaller image is of a real crucified victim's heel bone with a nail still through it. The bigger image is how it would have looked with the olive wood plank there. It prevents a victim from pulling themselves off the nails. So that's part of why, you know, it wasn't as gruesome as it's always depicted in the paintings and scholarly consensus and Christian apologists. The other thing that was important was that in 31 CE, Tiberius, who had just gotten rid of Sejanus, who had been running the empire pretty much, Sejanus was very anti-Semitic, and he probably was the one who hired Pilate to his position. But when Tiberius found out that Sejanus was trying to take over as emperor, he got rid of him. And after he got rid of Sejanus, he set out a decree to the whole Roman Empire, to all the officials, to honor all the local customs. And the local customs in the Jewish world, in Palestine, was 39 lashes for somebody to be punished. It didn't have to, it could be less than 39, but it could not be more than 39. And they were very specific about how a victim was to be lashed, so that if it was threatening their life, or if they defecated or urinated during the process, they stopped the flogging. So what we're looking at is Jesus only getting 39 lashes. And the reason we see this, and we can connect it to what Tiberius said and sent out the decree, is that in the Gospels, the Jews say to Pilate, "You will be no friend of Caesar's." And that's a clue that they're aware of the decree, and they're reminding Pilate that he has to observe the decree and respect their customs. So let me show you quickly, if I can do this, if it'll show up. No, you can't see that. Okay. This is a model of how Jesus actually would have been crucified. He would have been tied at the upper side of the elbows, and he would have had his feet, as we saw in the picture of the first century victim, that his feet would have been on either side of the stipes. Okay. At the top, because the Romans were very efficient, the patibulum, the crosspiece, would have just slotted onto a mortise and tenon joint. And it would have taken maybe 3 Roman soldiers to crucify him. The Roman army was very, very efficient, and the cross itself would have been set very low next to a road leading into the city so that people could see the face of the crucified victim. So it would have taken 2 guys to tie his arms. They would have hammered in the plaque like that, both in his hands and in his feet. And the cross would have been low enough so that as people walked along the road, they would have been faced with the victim's face. He wasn't high up, didn't need a ladder to hang him on the cross. This would have been done easily on the ground, and 2 soldiers, one on each end of the patibulum, would have lifted it up and put it on the stipes, and that would have been the crucifixion. He would have been flogged with 39 or less lashes, and he would have been crucified in such a manner that he would not have necessarily had trouble breathing. The idea was that in a normal crucifixion for non-Jews, apparently, they were left on the cross for days until they died of exposure or dehydration, loss of blood, whatever it may have been. Jesus didn't have to face any of that stuff. Trying to think what else. Those are the things that I think modern scholarship does not understand. Once the Jews had Rome allow them their customs, they took advantage of it, and especially with Jesus, they made sure that Pilate understood that he had to respect their customs. The fact that he was, in fact, Jesus was crucified was by the Romans, and that didn't change. The Jews of the time had stopped ordering capital punishment that required the death penalty. They had stopped that, but they didn't stop the whipping, the flogging. And if anybody wants to look it up, go to the Jewish Encyclopedia and look up, I think it's stripes, and that will give you some idea of what Jesus actually went through. Now, there's more to the story than that, but I'm going to yield back to Jacob because where am I at for time, Sean?
Well, I wasn't keeping time as being informal.
That's okay.
I didn't keep time, but that's fine.
That's fine. We're casual on this.
Yeah.
So I can respond properly.
sorry.
I want something clarified. You date the Gospels before Paul, and therefore you take an interpretation of the Gospels that you depend on for some of the things you just argued, right?
Yes. My position is that
Okay.
the Gospels. What?
I said okay.
The Gospels were written late 30s, early 40s, and it's based on the Alexandria riots of 37, I think it was, and Philo's embassy to Gaius. If you read Philo's accounts, both in Flaccus and in Embassy, you'll see how much strain the Jews were under and what they were most afraid of and what Jesus actually spoke about with the destruction of the temple. He was going to destroy the temple because Caligula was talking about putting a statue in the temple. And Caligula had sent an army, I think a couple of legions, to make the Jews comply. And at that point, and this is what people accused Jesus of in his trial, that he claimed that he was going to destroy the temple. So the word abomination in Greek is a singular neuter word. In other words, it's a thing. It's a single thing. It's not a man, not a woman, not a bunch of spears, not a bunch of shields. It's a single object, which the statue of Caligula would have been. And that is a better way to date the Gospels than the idea that somehow or other somebody, and this apparently was first brought up like in the 1700s, that whoever wrote the Gospels was using the destruction of the temple in 70 to show that Jesus was prophetic and could read the future. That's really convoluted and awkward. The idea that Caligula was going to put a statue in the temple makes more sense for Jesus to be aware of that and to be troubled by it enough to say, when this happens, it's going to be bad and everybody needs to go away. They need to run.
So I'd like to go ahead and respond. First off, in my view, there's no basis for dating the Gospels that early, and usually it's apologetics that would put the Gospels that early, but they have their reasons for doing that. Paul's letters show no awareness that the temple was destroyed, but the Gospels do, especially when looking at Marcion's edition of Paul. I'm gonna try to share something here from the Apostolos reconstruction that Vincent and Bilby and Jack Bull had worked on. Let me just see if I can pull it up real quick. There's a point that I want to make involving Paul. I don't trust what Acts says about Paul. I prefer to only use the letters. Let's see. I guess I'll just have to make do with this. No, it's not that did not come out right. I wish we were on StreamYard because it would have been easier for me to share it than it would have been for me here. And
I do apologize for that.
I'll just read it here. So this is in Marcion's Paul. Boasting is necessary, for I will move on into revelations of the Lord. A human was snatched away up to the third heaven, into the paradise, and heard unspeakable speakings, which are not allowed for a human to speak. So in the Marcionite edition of Paul, and that's from the Literary Metamorphosis, it's in the description, being very specific on where this is coming from. Anyway, Paul doesn't tell us that Jesus said anything to him. He doesn't even tell us that is specifically Jesus in these passages. In the book of Acts, Jesus actually says things to Paul. And Paul looked up, he saw a bright light. That's what the book of Acts says. So you see, it's a bright light. It's not a physical human being going up to Paul. It's not. It's not someone who's alive. This is in the letters, it's more like a vision, and in Acts, it's in which Acts makes Paul into kind of like a superhero. Like he does miracles that the letters of Paul never state that he did. Much of what you said, David, when you were providing your rebuttal, was not even really evidence for Jesus surviving the crucifixion. You did state several facts, but they don't really amount to Jesus surviving the crucifixion, I'm afraid. And even if somehow the Gospels did predate Paul, I still don't see how that would help very much with the case. Now, the Gospels, I think, were written in the 2nd century. And even if they're late 1st century, regardless, they're after 70 CE. The temple was destroyed. It was a massive catastrophe. They wanted to put things into Jesus' mouth. They wanted to make Jesus foretell the precise way the temple would be destroyed. They were very clear about this. The historical Jesus might have predicted the temple was destroyed. I don't have a problem with that. Jesus ben Ananus is another individual who thought the temple would be destroyed. Josephus talks about that. However, we haven't talked about this part yet. You think Jesus ben Ananus and Jesus Christ are somehow the same person, which makes no sense to me.
What was that again?
You think Jesus ben Ananus and Jesus Christ are the same person.
Yes, absolutely.
That makes no sense to me. So, I mean, Josephus says Ananus is the guy's father. There's no indication that's his grandfather. There's no reason for me to believe that's his grandfather. And in the Gospels, Joseph is supposed, as Luke and John say, as supposed to be the father of Jesus. There's no indication in the Gospels that that Ananus is Jesus' father. So that
Would be
I don't.
maternal grandfather.
Yeah, the
I
Gospels
know
don't
it's,
tell us about that either.
well, here's the thing. First of all, the Gospels and Jesus do not talk about the temple being destroyed. They talk about it in a future tense, that this is what's going to happen. Now, most scholars say that, especially in Mark, there's an immediacy to the tone of voice, the tone of writing that's going on, as if things are happening right then and there. The Ananus story, I'm kind of going off into the weeds because I do want to talk to you about how he survived and what happened to him. The Ananus story is very clear. Jesus shows up, and Josephus calls him Jesus ben Ananias. Okay, Ananias is the same as Annas in the Gospels, the high priest. We know that Caiaphas is the son-in-law of the high priest Annas. There is the Miriam ossuary that says Miriam, daughter of Jesus, son of Caiaphas. So Caiaphas had a son named Jesus. He was the son-in-law of Annas or Ananias. The story in Josephus says that this Jesus ben Ananias shows up in 62 CE, the year that his brother James is killed, the year that the head of the Jerusalem church is killed. And for the next 4 years, this Jesus hides his identity, but he speaks loudly the same proclamations that the gospel Jesus was talking about. Then in 66, when the war starts, he is no longer hiding his identity, and he is called Jesus ben Ananias. You have to look at those links and at least ask yourself, is that possible? We have an ossuary that says Caiaphas has a son named Jesus. We have Caiaphas as the son-in-law of Annas. Josephus talks about this character as hiding his identity for 4 years because he still would have been wanted. If he survived the crucifixion, he still would have been wanted by the Roman authorities, even that much later. So yeah, I think the gospel Jesus is the same as the Jesus ben Ananias character. That would put him in his early 70s.
I like to respond to the claim
Sure.
real quick that Jesus ben Annas is Jesus Christ somehow. So number one, Josephus mentions Jesus Christ in the James passage and the Testimonium Flavianum. In neither case does he ever tell us that that's the same person as Jesus ben Annas. You then proceed to make the claim that the Jesus, who is the son of Caiaphas in the ossuary, is somehow the same person as the biblical Jesus. There's no basis for this. They just have the same name. That doesn't mean anything. There's no clear.
No, wait. Yes, it does mean something. Just because the name is common is just an observation. It's not a refutation of who that person may be. You can't say that just because somebody has a common name that you can't claim he is so and so.
And my point is we can't
accurate.
we can't claim either way. So we can't know that's our Jesus.
Well, you can if you realize that a couple of things. If he survived, and I believe that he was crucified in the spring of 37. If he survived, if there was an empty tomb and the Romans found out about it, one of the things that they would have done, and Tiberius did this with Sejanus, is damnatio memoriae. They would have wiped out any reference to Jesus because he escaped Roman justice. Now, with a Jew, you're not going to have statues, you're not going to have plaques, you're not going to have coinage, you're just going to have his name. And under those circumstances, if anybody wrote about Jesus or spoke his name, they were open to the death penalty by the Romans. That's how seriously they took that stuff. So what you see is the Romans clamping down, they would have destroyed the tomb because that would have been an item like a statue or whatever. They would have destroyed any tomb, and they would have absolutely clamped down completely on that, on the name of Jesus. Even so, as long as Pilate was in office, which I think was over a decade, we don't have one single work of his office, no record of anything that he did, said, wrote down, nothing. And that could have been easily the same thing. If he wrote about Jesus and the crucifixion and Jesus getting away, that kind of information would have been destroyed by the Romans. That's
Well,
just the way they handle things.
that's very hypothetical. We don't have any evidence of that. On top of that, if the Romans were, you're making a claim that the Romans went hardcore persecution on the Christians. That they're just trying to cover up Jesus in every way they can. I don't see any evidence of that. Josephus talked about Jesus, and he's writing toward the end of the first century. In the 40 CE, Paul, 50 years before Josephus wrote the Antiquities, Paul writes about Jesus in the 40 CE. They don't kill him for writing about
Writing
Jesus.
about a celestial. He's writing about a celestial
But
Jesus.
he says
That
that
didn't-
Jesus was crucified by the rulers on earth, and he also blames the Jews for killing Jesus too in First Thessalonians. So that doesn't sound like a celestial to me.
He also says that he was crucified in space.
He does not say
If I-
that. No,
Okay.
that's wrong.
Regardless,
the
what you see-
archons
what
of
you
the
see-
earth.
What you see is that both Pilate and Caiaphas, two of the longest standing political operatives in that time and place, both lost their jobs in 37. They lost it, I think, and this is speculation, they lost it, I think, because of the empty tomb, because Jesus had escaped crucifixion. Now, I know I'm kind of taking up a lot of the time, but I want to go over with you how it was done.
Before you do, before
Sure.
you start there, I'm going to get this in. I'm going to read from the Literary Metamorphosis here. This is from Marcion's Paul, everybody. Just want to keep making that clear. Now I know, let me start over. Now I make known to you, brothers, the evangelion which I evangelize to you, through which you are also saved, to which word I evangelize to you. You are obliged to hold fast, for I have handed over to you at first that the Anointed died, and he was buried, and he was raised on the third day. So he is trying to tell us very clearly here that Jesus died. He experienced a burial, that's earthly, and he rose on the third day. Nothing here is about somebody getting nailed in outer space. Okay, David.
It's okay. I can pass on that. He's not an eyewitness. His reports were not from eyewitnesses. The fact that he says he was buried, that Jesus was buried, I don't have a problem with that. The thing about that that's really important as to whether Jesus survived the crucifixion is the Gospels make a point of saying a new tomb where nobody had been buried. Do you know why they said that? Because he was still alive. If he was dead, that wouldn't make any difference whatsoever where he was buried. If he's alive, he can't be buried in a tomb where other corpses have been, because then he would have been ritually impure and he couldn't walk around. It would have taken a week of ritual bathing for him to restore himself to where he could be out and about with other people. So the fact that the Gospels talk about a new tomb makes perfect sense if he's alive. Now, the trick, and here's something that, nobody's going to agree with, but here's the case. There are no miracles in the Gospels. There are magic and there are metaphors. Turning water to wine is a magic trick. Hieron of Alexandria had come up with a vessel that was split in half that you could fill with water, and the other side had wine in it, and it would come out as wine. That's a magic trick. The resurrection, the empty tomb, is based on a magic trick that is still used today. It's called the empty box trick. People took him in to the tomb, cleaned him up, got clean clothes on him, got him squared away, maybe even shaved his beard down and cut his hair. And then they got him back out again right away before they sealed the tomb. That's the empty box trick. Jesus was known as a sorcerer and a magician. This would not have been anything that they could not have done. This is well within the realm of their being able to accomplish these things. That's what happened. They drugged him on the cross with a sponge loaded with drugs, and it was on a hyssop branch. Now you ask yourself, why does it have to make a thing about the branch? Because whoever delivered that to him, touched his lips with it, couldn't touch the sponge, because then they would be affected. So he had to put the sponge on a stick, hold it up to his lips, and that put Jesus out. He looked dead. The piercing of the side with the spear was not a death blow. It was just to check his physical reaction to it. He had none. We can get into the fact that he not only sweated blood in the Garden of Gethsemane, but he also had watery blood coming out of the spear, wound. Those are indications of a genetic problem. Okay, this is a real guy. This is absolutely, I've checked it with hematologists and looked at it every which way you can, and that's basically what he was suffering from, which indicates why he didn't have much to say when he was accused by Pilate. Because when you're going through hemolytic anemia and hematohydrosis, which is the red blood cells break down and mix with the plasma, so it's watery blood, you're very tired and you're not oxygenating very well. The argument that the apologists make now is that the spear thrust was so deep that it broke the pericardial sac, and that's what killed him. And unfortunately, that's not possible. I've had pericardial effusion. I've had that same situation because I had open heart surgery. And if you take your fist and take either 1 or 3 tablespoons of some fluid and pour it over your hand, that's how much pericardial fluid is in your pericardial sac. The idea that that amount of blood and water or fluid could come out of a spear wound just isn't realistic medically.
I'd like to respond. So where's this
Sure.
evidence that there's drugs being put into Jesus' body? Do we have a text for that? The gospel? Because I don't
You
remember
have the
gospel
gospel
saying.
account of somebody running up. A Roman soldier had already offered Jesus a sponge with gall, which was sour wine or vinegar wine, and he had refused it. When he had been on the cross long enough, he felt, he said, "I thirst," and somebody, a bystander, came up, activated the stuff by putting it into the gall, but it was on a hyssop branch so that he didn't have to touch it. It was a transcutaneous, transdermal application of a drug, totally within the bounds of what they knew at the time. And almost immediately after that, he goes into a coma-like state. The timing is too coincidental to be anything but that. You could argue that, there's no proof of that, and where do we get that? Okay, you can, absolutely. But reconstructing history is not about facts. It's about creating a plausible explanation for the data that we do have. And that explains it to me. He was drugged, he went out, they thought he was dead. His followers came and got him and took him to the tomb. They put him in the tomb, they cleaned him up, got him dressed, took him out of the tomb, closed the tomb, and he was gone. He was allowed to recover for 3 days. And remember, this nail isn't like what they show you and all the, nonsense that they put out. They put out these great big nails that would have taken, pounding after pounding to get it in. No, Roman soldiers were more efficient than that. And this doesn't leave a very big hole. So if a guy can cut off his own arm, believe me, people can survive, 4 nail wounds.
Well, I'd like to go ahead and respond. So, number one, again, that is a lot of speculation there. Paul knows nothing about any of this. When
Yeah.
Josephus recounts the belief that Jesus rose from the dead, he knows nothing about any of this. Um, it's you're saying a lot of things, but there's not really much substance behind it. And also, I want to come back to the Joseph Caiaphas claim. There's, in order to believe that Jesus is the son of Joseph Caiaphas, you would have to make the argument that Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Joseph Caiaphas are the same person. We have no
Hmm.
evidence of this. The Gospels never claim that they never claim that they're the same person at all, ever.
Why would
I'm
they?
not aware of any Christian. I'm not aware of Christian tradition, and any tradition that claims that they're the same person. There seems to be no awareness of that.
Yeah. Why would anybody make that claim? Look, the context of the Gospels is under Roman domination. If you think that they're going to write Gospels that give the street address of where Jesus lived or the exact name of his parents or, whatever it may be, you don't understand the context. Okay. The Gospels are written in code for a specific reason because they're political in nature and the Romans will jump all over that unless there is some kind of deniability. No, we're not talking about that. We're talking about this. This is more theological. It's not political. And no, and Paul is party to this too. They are not going to make an historical Jesus evident to the Romans at all. I mean, that would just be crazy. It's like Second World War, Nazi occupied France, the French underground. Now they had the benefit of radio to communicate with each other, but they weren't posting, hey, this is so and so, and he lives at such and such, and that's his wife, and this is that. No, they were keeping it all secret. Okay, that just makes sense. Um, all of the miracles are just metaphors for trying to convert people to his point of view. If somebody's blind, he gets them to see his point of view. If they can't hear, he gets them to listen to what he's trying to teach, what he wants to do. If they can't speak or if they're crippled, those are people that he's got to convince to take action, to do something. Um, like I said, there's no miracle. If there was a miracle in there, and it's funny, but there's a new American version of the New Testament that includes this line that when they're talking about Jesus and all the things that he could do, filling up all these books, and they're listing all the things that he's done, this new version includes restoring limbs, which is never part of the Gospels. That would be a miracle. If they had included something like that or moving a mountain, whatever, those would have been miracles. They don't include those. They're just metaphors. This is political. They're trying to keep it low key. This is why more people didn't know about him or write about him because they're
I
keeping it low key.
I think that Paul really hurts your case because I know you're gonna try to dismiss it as celestial Jesus as you did earlier, but that it doesn't matter. They would know he's talking about him anyway. He specifies Jesus Christ, Christ Jesus. So yes. So that doesn't make any sense. I mean, why didn't Paul get killed by the Romans for saying that? And
Because he's a Roman agent. But he doesn't agree with any of the apostles, the original apostles. And
when
they
you
kind of say, go to the Gentiles, go preach to them.
so
If Paul is persecuting the followers, the earliest followers of Jesus, and then he has this, convenient conversion vision, which I don't buy for a second, and he starts, preaching about Jesus, but he doesn't give any real biographical details. He kind of creates a separate Jesus that he's preaching about. And Paul himself says, if I'm preaching to the Jews, I'm Jewish. If I'm preaching to the Gentiles, I'm a Gentile. The guy is a liar. The guy will say whatever he needs to say to motivate people away from the original Jesus movement. Why anybody would trust anything that he says is beyond me. But everybody does. Everybody goes to Paul. Even the mythicists go to Paul as some kind of source, some kind of accurate source about a historical Jesus, whether he existed or not. Anybody that's going to admit to lying, right away, I'm not taking him too seriously. Now, as far as Josephus and the testimonium, I don't believe any of that. And if you look at it, it comes in the chapter right before the Samaritan uprising. And I believe Jesus and John were involved in that Samaritan uprising. That's why you have the parable of the Samaritan woman at the well. That all takes place right where the original kingdom of David broke up, right at Jacob's well and at a town called Tirathaba.
So you're now claiming that the Samaritan and Jesus are another person. So just so everybody can keep track.
No, no, I'm not claiming that. No, I'm claiming that's the same Jesus. That's the gospel Jesus. He, again, he puts in a parable what he's going to do, what needs to be done, so that it doesn't look like he can't go out and say, hey, I need you guys to revolt. I need you guys to start the revolt to the Samaritans. He can't do that because the Romans would pick up on that and he'd be snatched up like that and he'd be executed. No. That's all the same guy. They did this. They gave single individuals.
But hold on, you just told me Jesus isn't the Samaritan, but now you're saying they are the same person? Which is it?
In the Samaritan woman parable, she recognizes him as a Judean. Before he really says anything at all, she says, why would you, a Jew, offer me, this? So she knows he's Judean. He's not Galilean. She sees him as Jewish, Judean. He's not. She sees him as the Taheb, which is the Samaritan word for Messiah. So she already recognizes him as the Messiah. And he is a Judean, not a Galilean. So it's all the same guy. Read it again. I mean, people need to read it and understand where it's coming from.
I want everybody to keep track here so that you're rolling people into the same person. Jesus ben Ananias, the Samaritan, Jesus Christ. I mean, when we're not told anywhere about the Samaritan is Jesus, Josephus doesn't tell us that. You then, to make your argument work out better, you remove the testimonium from Josephus. Let's say you're saying he didn't write that because that doesn't fit in order to make Jesus a Samaritan.
Not a Samaritan. Again, he's not a Samaritan.
I know he's not this. Now you're claiming you're claiming he's the same person as who Josephus called the Samaritan, who led that revolt at Mount Gerizim.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all I'm saying. I'm not claiming. Yeah. So that doesn't make any sense to me. So we're rolling all these different people into the same person here. And there's just no evidence. Nobody's aware that they're the same person. When in the Gospels we get the Samaritan well parable, there's no indication a massacre just happened or is about to happen. There's no gathering of some kind of armed troops. So there's no indication of this. It's just another miracle story. There's no evidence of fighting going on in the Samaritan parable. So how do you explain that?
Because it was probably spoken about and written about before that took place. So while I believe that the Gospels in kind of their final form were written in the late 30s, early 40s, some of those stories go back to his early ministry. The Gadarene demoniac comes before. The Samaritan woman at the well comes before. Those were incorporated into the Gospels. They were written and talked about before the Samaritan uprising. Okay. If you look at the Gadarene demoniac, and this is a classic example of the writing that was going on, the basics of that story is that there is a madman that is basically chained to a cemetery. And he's been taken over by evil spirits. And the people want him to go away. Jesus comes to this guy And one of the first things he said to him, "What are you called?" And the Gadarene demoniac says, "My name is Legion." Okay. Jesus turns him into a herd of pigs, and they run down this mountain, jump off this cliff, and drown, presumably in the Sea of Galilee. Now, what does that relate to? That relates to the city of Tiberias being built on an ancient cemetery. The people, the Jews, couldn't live there because they would be unclean. So Antipas forces them to live there, and he uses the Roman 10th Legion to make sure that they stay in the city. What's the battle flag of the 10th Fretensis? It's a wild boar. It's a pig. So what you're seeing is a metaphorical story about an actual historical event that upset Jesus to the point where he spoke about it, preached about it.
I think another explanation is it could be explained by saying the Gospels are familiar with Josephus. Very slowly, over time, scholars are slowly coming to that point of view. There's already several arguing that Luke Acts knew Josephus. I just want to refer everyone to Steve Mason's wonderful book on Josephus and the New Testament. I've been convinced that Luke Acts knew Josephus for a long time. I also like to refer to Bartosz Adamczewski and Samuel Zinner, who argue that the Gospels postdate Josephus and that Mark knew Josephus. And Bartosz says all four Gospels knew Josephus. And I think Samuel holds that position as well, but I definitely know Bartosz does. I just realized there's a contradiction in your argument, David, as you were speaking. You claimed earlier that there's a damnatio Gomorrhae going on against Jesus, the damning of his memory, and yet you claim Paul is a Roman agent. How does that make any sense? I thought they were damning Jesus' memory. But just to really tie it all together, my point is, you claim that they were damning Jesus' memory anyway. And then you say Paul's a Roman agent. How does that work?
I thought
you claimed that they would kill anybody talking about Jesus, so I don't understand this.
Well, if he's a Roman agent, if Paul is a Roman agent, and he's reporting back to superiors, and he is saying, look, I'm going to take this in a different direction from the original intent that Jesus had of a military revolt. I'm going to guide it differently. So I'll be talking about Jesus. Okay, go ahead. It's not a problem that Paul talked about it if he's a Roman agent. As far as damnatio or damnatio memoriae is concerned, Tiberius did the same thing with Sejanus. He wiped out any recollection of him, any statues, any, plaques, whatever. The only thing that they've really been able to find is that a coin was found in Spain that had Tiberius's name on it and an S starting with would have been Sejanus on the other side of the coin. They stamped out the name Sejanus. Okay, so this was a tool that Tiberius used. Rome ruled by fear. And if somebody could get away with surviving a crucifixion, that created huge problems for the Roman state. So they had to quash any comments about it. I don't see why. Well, I'm sure you'll tell me.
You are claiming that they're trying to damn Jesus' memory on one hand, and on the other, they're letting Paul get away with talking about Jesus. When they damn a memory, they're trying to wipe out any trace. They don't care they're not going to care what it is. They're going to wipe any trace. But Paul, who's supposedly a Roman agent, and just so everybody understands, I'm not even convinced Saul of Tarsus and Paul are the same guy. I just talked about that last night with Captain Tadpole. That Acts, the Paul in Acts is such a massive contradiction to the one we see in the letters. They don't even have the same vision. They had two different visions. And you read the letters, Jesus never speaks to Paul. You get the idea in Acts, and Acts is plagiarizing Josephus anyway. And there's a Saul in Josephus. I'm not claiming that Saul is Paul. I think it's a totally different guy, and probably was the inspiration for the fiction that we see in Acts. Acts contradicts Paul's letters, and there's a lot of scholarship done on this. Like, there's issues involving the Jerusalem Council in Galatians. and the Jerusalem Council. We see in Acts. I'm not going to get into the details there. You can look it up. There's a lot of work that's been done on this by scholars, and they'll show you that Acts is contradicting Paul's letters over and over and over again. It's just a mess. I would not use Acts. But I must stress the point again. Let me come back. Are Paul and Saul the same guy or not? The Saul in Acts and Paul are the same guy or not, or two different things. I do think the historical Saul did change his name to Paul anyway, because we have other traditions about that. But regardless, that's the interesting thing about this is no matter how you take it, no matter how you slice it with Paul, you're not going to get he survived the cross, that Jesus survived the cross, and yet you're still insisting that the Romans are persecuting anyone, they're going to kill anyone that talks about Jesus, and yet Paul, the Roman agent, apparently, Paul, the letter writer, who you're claiming is a Roman agent, is allowed to be. They allow him. He gets away with it.
Yeah,
that makes no sense to me. And Paul tells us he was crucified. Jesus was crucified.
He was crucified
very clearly.
He was absolutely
buried
crucified.
And he rose from the dead.
Yeah.
So
he was buried, and it appeared
you
that
haven't addressed that contradiction.
There's no contradiction. Paul wrote like 13 years after the crucifixion. Okay, the damnatio memoriae would have been in place from 37 on. Now we don't know how long those things lasted. Probably through the life of the emperor that put it in place. Tiberius died in 37. So how long it lasted after that? How long the next Roman emperor would have honored that and kept that going, I don't know. But if Paul is writing like 13 years after these facts, and he's still trying to quash any thought of a rebellion, I don't see a contradiction there at all. There's none. There's none. Paul preached a different story than Jesus and the original apostles, and it was to subvert that movement. Well, not even subvert the movement, but to start a different movement with Gentiles to take Jesus into a different place. The memory or there's just no contradiction there. That's absolutely possible.
And then the other thing you're not addressing is, so Paul's going out, he's talking to other people about Jesus. That shows that there's a lot of people in the 40s and earlier talking about Jesus. No indication that a damnatio memoriae had occurred. But where is this evidence of this? So there's a lot of people around that Paul's encountering that believe in Jesus, and they believe him differently than he does. They're still around, no problem. Where's this massive persecution that you're talking about? I don't see it. Where is it?
I'm not talking about a massive persecution.
Well, that's what it would require if they're gonna pull off a damnation of memory. They're just gonna kill everybody talking about Jesus.
No. Because again, what I said just a few minutes ago, we don't know how long those stayed in force. Now, would it have affected any immediate writings, any pilot, official writings and stuff like that? Yes, it would have. Okay, but there's no massive persecution. Just Paul persecuting some of the earliest followers of Jesus. And that doesn't work. So then and again, if you want to believe in a miraculous vision, go ahead. I don't.
I think that's a Christian, so I don't.
I just think it's Paul finding a real good way to say, oh, I'm changing how I view this thing. I'm not going to persecute anymore because I've had this magical, mythical experience with Jesus. And now I get it. I'm going to, start preaching for him. So it's nonsense.
Let's try to roll some of the things that you're saying in a few points here. You got Jesus being on drugs somehow, declaring that the Samaritan and Josephus and Jesus Ben Ananus are somehow the same person as Jesus Christ. You remove the testimonium from Josephus to make that work, and you're claiming that these things are true, and that Jesus is son of Caiaphas too. That's what you're saying. So you're making Joseph and Caiaphas the same person. You're rolling these people over here to the same person, these people over here to the same person, and there's no traditions showing that any of this is true. We have no awareness that any of this is true. You're claiming that there's a damnation of memory. Then you put the Gospels before Paul, which I don't understand how that works. And then you got Paul being a Roman agent. Despite the fact
Yeah.
they're damning Jesus' memory, they're allowing Paul to write about Jesus.
13 years afterwards.
Well, I think he's writing in
And
the
even,
40s,
and again,
but
even if he's talking about Jesus, even if Paul is talking about Jesus, and the Roman authorities know what his mission is, they're not going to condemn him to death. He's doing their work. He's trying to
I
change
don't see
the
how.
whole mission. And you don't think that's possible? Really?
You
We've
haven't
never heard of
you haven't
history?
consulted Marcion's New Testament.
I don't care about Marcion because he comes later. The Gospels were written late 30s,
He collected
40s.
the New Testament before our canonical New Testament was collected, so he's actually earlier.
He That's not true. All of
Oh
those
yeah.
works that he collected were existed before he started to write. Otherwise, he
Yeah,
couldn't have collected.
Marcion knew about 10 letters of Paul and a single gospel.
Yeah.
And that single gospel has less
So they
miracles than our
existed. So
synoptics.
they existed prior to Marcion writing.
He's just the collector of the text.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah,
He's collecting existing texts.
yes, I know that. That doesn't
Okay.
help your argument.
So that your argument doesn't hold any
Yeah, but I'm not the one
weight
rolling
at
several
all
people
because
I'm not the one rolling people into the same person here and claiming Jesus was on
well,
drugs like Almon Hillman.
first of all, let's go back a little bit. Let's say that, if you're planning to have Jesus survive a crucifixion, if that's your political game plan, so that he looks like he is very much connected with God, and the Jews, wait a second, the Jews felt very strongly that in any upcoming war, they would have to have God basically on their side. So you choose crucifixion rather than having his head lopped off because you can't survive that. John had his head cut off. You can't survive decapitation. You can't survive drowning. You can't survive stoning. What can you survive? Crucifixion. Now, the Gospels say that Joseph of Arimathea took down Jesus. Arimathea doesn't exist. It's a what's the word I want? It's basically a combination of two other words. Airo in Greek means to take down, to take away, to remove. Airo in Greek. And Matthew or Mattathias means the gift of God. So Arimathea is a contraction of two words that mean to take down the gift of God. And his name is Joseph. So all the men in Jesus's life that had any impact on him are all named Joseph. His father, Joseph Caiaphas, and now Joseph of Arimathea. Do you really think that that's not meant to say something? Do you really think that that's just weird coincidence? That's a plan.
Yeah,
They're talking about the same.
Yeah, the Greek word methitis, might be mispronouncing that slightly.
Me too.
Means best disciple, but
It's based on the Hebrew word,
now
but it's based on the Hebrew word.
now I know this is a later individual, but Eusebius in the 4th century actually thinks that Arimathea is Ramathum Zophim, and Ramathum Zophim was a town in Ephraim, the birthplace of Samuel. So that's where Samuel was born, the Old Testament figure Samuel. But regardless of whatever the hell Arimathea means, it can mean anything. The meaning is irrelevant in the debate here because it doesn't prove your claim that he survived the cross, in my opinion.
Okay, so the fact that the tomb was found empty, that the two leading public figures both lost their jobs at the same time, and that there is an account in Josephus about a Jesus, Ben Ananias, doesn't lead you to construct an idea. I don't see any.
Okay,
I don't
again,
see.
we're back to rolling people into
I
the
don't
same
see
person.
any. Yeah,
Why?
They're all the same
I have
person.
no reason to think they're the same person.
And that's why that was written that way in the Gospels. And in
Yeah, so now we're getting into conspiracy
Josephus,
territory that they're trying to hide. They're trying to hide it to the same person.
yeah, and it's worked for 2,000 years.
Oh, so, so
You don't believe it.
uh,
Is it possible? Is it possible?
I'm not even.
That
I haven't been given sufficient evidence to really think so. Like I don't see why I should
you don't
think
think
they're the
that's
same.
possible? In all human,
Here's how I'm going to put it, because you're trying to ask a trick question here. So you're trying to trick me into saying
no,
it's possible, and therefore you're going to write off that. So here's what I will say. I'd be surprised. This is the only way I'm answering your question. I'd be surprised if you survived the crucifixion. Now, Edward Dodge, now he argues, like you do, that Jesus survived the crucifixion, but he died shortly thereafter, that after the crucifixion from his injuries. Which, at least he doesn't roll all these different people into the same person. But there's something I want you to make clear. Because not only do you claim that Joseph, the stepfather or father of Jesus, whatever, supposed father of Jesus, and I'm only putting it that way because that's how Luke and John do, sort of. And you get to, you claim that Joseph and Joseph Caiaphas are the same dude.
yep,
But you also claim he's Joseph of Arimathea too, right?
yep.
So you just rolled three Josephs into the same person. Where
Yep.
in the Gospels do they claim that's the same person? They
Why
call
do you
one.
keep saying that? Because
Okay,
there's
hold on, let me just finish. Joseph Arimathea, he's called that, and the way that they're calling him that is to distinguish him from Joseph, the supposed father of Jesus, and the other guy, Joseph Caiaphas, the high priest. So these are ways of distinguishing these people. In the same way Josephus distinguishes Jesus Christ from the Samaritan dude at Mount Gerizim, and also Jesus ben Ananias. We haven't even talked about the Egyptian yet, who you also think is Jesus. That's four people right
could
there.
be. I'm not as strong on that, but yeah, it
Well,
could
we're
be.
working on four
No,
people being the same person here.
yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
what?
And we're also calling Joseph and Asenath Jesus' parents. That's a metaphorical story, an
I don't know.
allegorical story.
I'll be honest. I don't know how I feel about that. You know, I had Simca and Barry on recently, and they talk
Yep.
about connections between Jesus and Joseph and Asenath. It's interesting,
Yeah.
but even if they're right or if you're right, I don't see how that leads to him surviving the cross. Like, help me out
I've
here.
already explained it to you. He's only given
Do it
39
again.
lashes. Okay. He's only given 39 lashes. Okay. Certainly he's not bleeding out like, like I said, like Mel Gibson's image of him. Um, he is taken down. Well, he is given a drug to knock him out. Everybody is surprised, including Pilate, that if he's only got 39 lashes and he's only been crucified for 6 hours, how the hell did he die? And so Pilate says, go stick a fork in this guy and see if he's really dead. And Jesus doesn't respond to that because he's been drugged. Then they take him down, supposedly dead. They take him, put him in the new tomb, the brand new tomb, so he's not been affected by going to. And the other thing too is that all of this is taking place during a high holy day. So for any of them to go near a real tomb that's got, had corpses in it, they would all be contaminated and they would all have to spend nearly a week ritual bathing to become okay again. But they take him to this new tomb where nobody's been laid. They take him in there, they clean him up, they put clothes on him, and they take him right out again. Now, in the Gospels, all the witnesses are at a distance and it's getting dark. Okay, so the witnesses are not really going to be able to see exactly what's going on. That's part of, writing in the Gospels. They could have had it any other way, but they chose to make the witnesses at a distance, and that by the time they do all this, it's getting dark. They take Jesus away. They've got 3 days to get him back on his feet, take care of his wounds, make sure he's okay. And this is called the empty box trick. You see it with magicians today. There'd be a magician or an assistant that gets into a box. You see it happening. They lift the box way up in the air, and all of a sudden the thing breaks loose and it comes slamming down, and there's nobody in there. Okay? Because they have managed to get the person that got into the box out of the box without the audience knowing it. This is what they did. Now, it's in the Gospels. All of that stuff is right there. The Gospels do not share any information about the scourging. They do not say how severe it was. So, according to the decree of 31 and Philo's own comments, the Jews would have given him a lashing of no more than 39 stripes. Okay? So, all of that is explained. It's very clear. I don't understand why you're struggling with it. I mean, it's right there. Does somebody run up with a
Well,
sponge on a stick? Yes, they do.
So technically, we're kind of working our way up to, like, I don't know how many people now. 4 people for Joseph are the same person. So we're working on Joseph and Asenath.
Yeah.
And so that's what you're talking about. And you're trying to claim that that's talking about Joseph, Jesus' father. There's no way to really
Yep.
know that. And therefore, you assume that somehow that's coherent evidence for what you're talking about. Is that's the that's the thing. That's the biggest problem with your argument. Is in the end, it all comes down to rolling 4 people into Joseph, rolling 3 to 4 people into Jesus. You're making these different people the same person,
Yeah.
and that doesn't make sense to me. Let alone the
And it
problems
never
of
will.
going into the contradictory resurrection accounts, which I think actually hurts the Swoon theory. It already ruins the resurrection as it is. I mean, that crap's been that's a train wreck. But you're trying to salvage it into some kind of Swoon theory.
I'm not trying to salvage it at all.
Well,
I'm telling you,
you're
that's
trying to make sense
explanation.
of a natural explanation that I don't think is necessary.
Well-
Why do we need him to? Why?
Why?
Yeah.
It's
why?
not a question of why. Well, first of all, the why is that if he presents himself as being resurrected from dead, that says something about his connection to God, that God could have raised him from the dead. That means he has a real connection to God. And if you're going to start a rebellion and everybody that is in your society really, and this is Dead Sea Scrolls, these are the Essenes, these are the Zealots, everybody expects God to take part in that if God is on your side.
Sure, but
So you plan this, and say to yourself, we can make it look like this, and I can get up and around after 3 days, and I can go see people. They'll see an empty tomb, and that will convince them that I've been raised from the dead. Now, the odd part is, and this is true of the Gospels, and it's true of mythicism, and it's a little bit more surprising in mythicism than it is in the Gospels. Nobody sees the actual resurrection. Nobody sees it. They either see him as they think he's dead on the cross, or they see him after 3 days. You would think that if somebody was writing fiction, that would be one of the main miracles that they would really focus on. They would say there was a blinding flash of light, or there was a roll of thunder, and Jesus recovered from death. There's none of that because it didn't happen. He didn't resurrect. He was still alive.
so
And it's like I said, it's worked for 2,000 years. People don't want to see it. They don't want to make those connections.
well because they wouldn't. Why would they think 4
Can't
people are the
hear you.
same?
Yeah, you're muted, Jacob.
Okay, fair. Why? Well, why would they? Because you're claiming 4 people are the same person as Jesus. You're rolling. Yeah, the Egyptian, Samaritan, Jesus ben Ananias. I mean, it just keeps going, and now you're doing the same thing with Joseph.
You're not being fair. I did not include the Egyptian in this
Okay, but
conversation.
okay, we still got
You
the other
have
2 to work
interjected
with.
that.
We still got the
Huh?
other 2. You're still claiming. Okay, you're still claiming that the Samaritan and Jesus ben Ananias are the same person. So we're still dealing with 3 people here. So you're still conflating them. So I am being fair. Okay, maybe 1 less than I thought, but doesn't matter. You're still conflating people into the same person.
Well, if there is a ossuary box that says that Caiaphas had a son named Jesus, and Caiaphas is the son-in-law of Annas, and Annas is the same name as Ananias.
There's another one
And
in the Talpiot tomb, Jesus, son of Joseph, and that Joseph is not the same person as Joseph Caiaphas. That's just two different ossuaries right there.
yeah,
How are you gonna make that work? You know, just Jesus? Does Jesus have two ossuaries now? That doesn't make sense.
what's the
That
first one?
reminds me of a joke.
Laren, Laren's my other co-host. He wants to ask some questions. You're in the
I
live chat.
just before we mention the two ossuaries, I'm reminded by a joke, and I'm just gonna tell it briefly before the question, just to liven things up a bit. A Jewish guy
Lively
gets
enough?
on a Jewish guy gets on a desert island, and it's been like 10 years, and they find him, and he got his necessities, but he also built a synagogue. It's like, okay, religious needs, and then they see he built another synagogue and another one, and they ask him, why did he build three synagogues? He says, oh, that's the synagogue I always go to. That's the synagogue I sometimes go to. And that one over there, that's the synagogue you won't catch me dead inside. Yeah, I had two
There.
questions. One, you said that the Romans didn't want people to think you could survive a crucifixion, but Josephus has like a line that says, "Oh yeah, I just saw the guys getting crucified, and I knew one of them, and
Yeah, the
after
three
3 days
guys.
he was
Yeah,
okay." Yeah, three guys, and after 3 days, one of them was like okay, and he was like, "Hey, can I bring him down?" And yeah, that's in Bellum Udum. And my other thing is Aramna. Sorry, Amar. I can't say it. Amaratia. Okay, I'm thinking about this in Hebrew, but I'm trying to say this in English. Amar. That place, the place you said doesn't exist.
Arimathea.
Aramatea. 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 I think I know that. That one means two hills. I've lived in Israel. I used to live in Israel. Now I live in Ireland. I used to pass by like a place on a bus, and some guy said, "Hey, look, it's the place the Christians called Aramatea, and it's like this a village now." And it means like two hills in Aramic, because like Aram Naharaim means the two rivers, and Naharaim, okay, that's similar to Nahar. That I can get. Aram just means two, and Maratia just means like hill. So yeah, those are my two questions. Like,
No, I've read
yeah,
that about the the possible meaning of Arimathea, meaning two hills. I've heard that
right,
before.
Aram, like Aram Naharaim, which is
Yeah,
the
yeah. I
yeah.
think the more cogent argument is that arrow in Greek means to take down or to remove or take away. So it's a contraction of to take down the gift of God. Matthew in Hebrew is the gift of God. So aromathea is to remove the gift of God. Now that is somebody that has taken Jesus down from the cross. So
Wouldn't
that's
it be Matara, because the grammar would put the Hebrew before the Greek, because that's how Hebrew grammar has to. I don't know. I don't know
yeah,
Greek grammar
it's
actually.
Greek. It's essentially a Greek name with
So is
arrow.
it?
But at that point, it's like
Isn't it easier just to say there was a place between two hills than, you know?
no, because you're right up against a guy that took Jesus down from the cross. That makes a lot of sense to me. You would be struggling to figure out two hills as a location.
I mean,
Uh,
that's a common name. Like, there was a TV show called Twin Peaks, and the guy who made it was just like, yeah, let's just find a whatever name, and
yeah,
it's
but they
like Twin
also say
Peaks,
that
like two hill.
Arimathea is Ramathon or whatever. They've had two or three different locations that they think might have been Arimathea. So
There was a lot of hills in Galilee, you know? Yeah. Also, like, you said that they couldn't let people think you could survive a crucifixion, but Josephus does right. That's right. It's like, yeah, I saw a guy survive a crucifixion. I was like, can we get him
let
down? I
me
kind of know him.
let me say something about that now.
Yeah.
Well, the difference there is those three men clearly. They were being crucified. They were supposed to die, and Josephus was wanting them to be spared, and so Commander Titus authorized them to be taken off the cross. So you see, there was an official attempt to save them. There was no conspiracy, and so they were taken off the cross. Two of them die anyway, which is telling, despite receiving top-notch medical treatment at the time. They
All the
died
time.
they died, and only one survived, barely, I guess. So
for
I'm
a
like,
short time.
so it's not.
He died.
Yeah, it doesn't really help. And if anything, I think I think if Edward Dodge would have used that as an argument for him because he thinks Jesus died not long after the crucifixion. I mean, his
So
version of the
did
Swoon theory would,
Hugh Schoenfield.
yeah, Hugh Schoenfield too. Yeah, the Passover plot. Everybody, that's what that book's called. Um, yeah, I have major issues with that version of the Swoon theory as well, but I I can at least understand. Okay, they still at least say that the injuries caused him to die not long after. But I'd be very hard pressed to think Jesus lived 40 years or so, or 30, 40 years after the crucifixion.
I
I
mean,
find that
just
hard to believe.
medically speaking, that would be ridiculously difficult to achieve, especially with the technology of the time and overnight. Like we're talking heist of the century, like those convoluted movie plots that people are like, you know.
Yeah, I don't see it that way. I don't think it's convoluted at all. And for him to survive 40 years, he certainly wasn't going to hang around Jerusalem. He would have disappeared, gone somewhere else, hid out because he was still wanted by the Roman authorities because there was no body. So either somebody took the body or he disappeared because he survived. He's not going to hang around. And he only comes back on the social scene, the political scene, when his brother is killed in 62 CE, when James is killed, according to the Jesus ben Ananias story. So for all those years, he was somewhere else. I
You
don't
want to hear
have,
something funny?
well, be nice.
Ananas is pineapple in Hebrew.
What?
Ananas is
Yeah,
pineapple in
it's
Hebrew.
true. Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So every time I hear Ben Ananias, I just think pineapple.
Well, let me respond to David. Let me make sure I don't. What were you saying again, David? I forgot when Larry was giving the joke. Oh wait,
As far,
James had just dying at 62. Okay, there, I remember now.
yeah.
It came back to me.
And that's when this
Well,
Jesus ben Ananias
even
showed.
if I agreed with you to toss out the entire testimonium as a total Eusebian era interpolation insertion into Josephus, you still have the James passage to deal with when it talks about James being the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, of course. And
Yeah.
in the way Josephus writes that is, in my view, a further evidence that he's distinguishing Jesus from Jesus ben Ananias. So there's nothing there that should make me think that's the same guy. So how do you get around that problem?
Well, again, if you're writing under Roman domination, you're not. I'm not sure why anybody's struggling with this. You're not going to write real relative connections. You're not. And if you're planning on pulling this off, you're not necessarily going to make a connection with Joseph, Caiaphas, and Jesus, or Jesus and Ben Ananias. But if you read the account in Josephus, it's clear he's talking about the gospel Jesus. It's absolutely clear. The wording that Jesus uses in that segment, and the fact that Josephus calls him kind of a country hick, which is the way Jesus presented himself from Galilee, which would be like calling somebody an Okie in this country.
I'm calling somebody a Galilean Hebrew today. It's a dump.
Well,
I'm sorry.
just
It's a dump.
let David finish what he's saying.
Now I lost track of what I was saying.
You're trying to make a point about Jesus
There is,
being a
yeah,
country boy, hokey or something like
yeah,
that.
because that's what Josephus called him, which is what Jesus presented. He presented himself as poor and from Galilee, but the Samaritan woman recognized him as Judean. Read the story again. She said, "Why would you, a Judean, not Jew, but a Judean, bother to talk to me, a Samaritan woman?" Okay, so it's to me clearly it's clear that these Jesuses are all the same, and you can draw a connection between Caiaphas having a son named Jesus, Caiaphas being the son-in-law of Annas, Annas being the same name as Ananias, and Jesus being the maternal grandson of Ananias.
Well,
And when you please read the account again and understand, he comes back in 62. He hides his identity for 4 years. When the war starts, there's no reason to hide his identity anymore because the war has begun. And basically, he comes out as Jesus ben Ananias. Now, if this Jesus ben Ananias is just some country bumpkin, why is he hiding his identity for 4 years while he walks around Jerusalem?
I
Why?
can think of a lot of reasons.
So
but-
let-
Can you?
Well,
Why?
Lauren, this is Lauren. Just
Sorry,
moderate
go
the
ahead.
chat. Just moderate the chat.
Yeah.
So I want to respond, David. So so again, we're back to the conflation problem. So Jesus and this other Jesus are both country boys. Okay. I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of country boys. What's the problem? Like, how is that evidence that they're the same person? I don't get it. Again, like, why should I think they're the same person? They're both called Jesus, and they're both country
Because
boys.
they
So what?
talk the same, they talk the same language, they say the same things exactly, almost word for word what the gospel Jesus was preaching. He is obviously a descendant of Ananias, and Ananias is the same name as Annas in the Gospels. And we have these connections there, and you have to explore it. If you don't buy it, you don't buy it. But I got to tell you, it's as profound as a lot of other connections that people buy into, that scholars study. There
I
are
mean-
things that, they've got it wrong about the fact that, Jesus was almost beat to death. Okay, that's just wrong. And scholars go along with that. There's no evidence that he was beaten nearly to death. There's none. It says in the Gospels that he was scourged or he was flogged. There's no amount. They have conflated what they have seen in other Roman punishments and assume that it was the same for Jesus. But the historical record indicates that it wasn't the same. Jesus got 39 lashes as the Jewish law dictated, and everybody was surprised that he died so quickly on the cross. Okay, well, he dies right after he gets a sponge put to his lips. Now, other scholars are just saying, oh, he was, Gary Habermas is like, oh, he couldn't have done this. He couldn't have survived. He would have asphyxiated. He couldn't push himself up on the cross. He would have had all this, bone showing, and it would have rubbed up against the stipes. All this nonsense that is not verified anywhere. It's assumed. But you have a problem with some of my assumptions. That's amazing to me. That's amazing.
Because scholars don't merge people into the same person.
No, but they
That's not
merge
standard.
punishment and the depth of punishment into the same situation.
I mean, look, I want to go back to Paul.
That's okay.
I want to come back to Paul real quick. So here's what Paul states: "You suffered, even you, by the fellow countrymen, your own, just as they themselves by the Judeans, the ones who killed both the Lord Jesus and the prophets, their own." So this is in the Marcionite edition of Paul. Now, again, using the literary metamorphosis, link is in the description below. You see, in this version of 1 Thessalonians 2:14 to 15, you see it's missing the reference to the wrath of God, because in the canonical version, it talks about in verse 16 that the wrath of God had come upon them at last, and that's an interpolation to make Paul look like he's aware the temple was destroyed. So that was added later. The Marcionite edition of Paul does not know anything about the temple being destroyed. That didn't happen yet. Now, the reason I wanted to read that, because Paul's writing in the 40s, not so many years after Jesus' crucifixion, about a decade or so. And he's blaming the Jews for, what do you say? The ones who killed both the Lord Jesus and the prophets, their own. So he thinks Jesus was killed. killed. I really want to put a lot of emphasis on this. He says that
Yeah.
he was buried and rose from the dead.
Yeah.
That there's
It all fits what I'm saying. He appeared dead to a lot of people on the cross, so much so that they stuck him with a spear and determined that they felt that he was dead. That's right in line with what you're saying. Was he buried? Yes, he was, in a new tomb, uncontaminated tomb. Okay? That is exactly what you're saying to me, that he was dead on the cross and that he was buried and that he rose 3 days later. None
But-
of that is beyond what I'm saying.
but
Everything
other
fits.
gods in the ancient world have died and risen again, like Osiris, Romulus, or whatever, Dionysus, Bacchus,
Yep.
Attis. So I mean, that,
Yep.
and we don't have anybody saying that they survived their death somehow. And Osiris, he was put back together after he was like cut into several pieces.
Yeah.
And so he's put back together, even given an artificial phallus. It's so. Why are we? It's like, why are you giving special pleading to Jesus? Like, okay, so he gets to survive an ordeal, whereas all the other ones that died and rose again didn't. Make that make sense to me?
I started out by saying this swoon theory is a conspiracy. So what you have is you write about Jesus in political propaganda, and you have the playbook of all those previous people that have supposedly died and risen, and some of that is questionable. Some of that is not as easy as you're saying. You have the playbook. So how do we find a way to put Jesus in that same situation, except in reality, he's going to survive? And they did. They figured it out. They knew what they were doing. Again, there's magic and metaphors all through the Gospels. And one of the big magic tricks is the empty box trick. If you don't want to believe that, okay. But the reality is they absolutely could have done that. And the Gospels lean towards that. Again, the witnesses to the burial are at a distance. It's almost dark. There's a group of men, and in normal times around the first century, those kind of tombs, unless they were for somebody that was like royalty or something, as we see in the Talpiot tomb, the openings are very small. So they would have had to drag a body in there, lay him on one of the stone benches, clean him up, whatever, and then gather around the opening and drag him back out so nobody could see. And he's in different clothes, and remember, people didn't recognize him. People that were close to him in the garden of outside of the tomb didn't recognize him at first because he had either been cleaned up and shaved or whatever. They didn't see Jesus at first. So these guys take him away, and he's got 3 days to recover from relatively minor wounds.
So I want to come back to.
I don't know.
I'm going to come back to what you were saying earlier because
Can't hear you.
I forgot to unmute.
That's all right.
Anyway, I didn't even hear what you were saying there, Lauren, because you're muted too. But anyway, just so I can make the point, David. It really comes back to your claim that there was a damnatio Gomorrhae that happened. And back to the claim that Paul's a Roman agent. And the reason why I'm coming back to that is because if the Romans were opposed to Jesus so much that they wanted to damn his memory, why not just have Paul, since you think he's a Roman agent, why not just have Paul come out there and say, oh, he survived the cross, everybody. It's lame, doesn't count. He didn't die and rise again. Why didn't they go around making fun of the Christians and saying, oh, he just survived? Why didn't they just do that? If they figured out that he survived the crucifixion, if this is true, why didn't they try to expose that? Why didn't Jesus' enemies come after him and just write down stuff contradicting this conspiracy to make it look like he rose from the dead? Why are they not doing this?
For the same reason that you don't believe it, because you don't believe it could have happened.
Well,
okay. So Paul wouldn't go around saying that because he would look at it like, yeah, nobody's going to buy this. My approach is going to be, I'm going to go to the Gentiles. I'm going to preach to them. I'm going to tell them what I think about Jesus. And it's not going to have as much bearing on the actual historical Jesus because I want him to be marginalized. I want him out of the picture. So I'm going to create a new picture. And for most of the people, they would have thought he did die on the cross, he was buried in the tomb, and then the tomb was found empty. So they would have been looking at different explanations for all of those things. Okay. Whether Paul would have said it, Paul wouldn't have said anything about it because he was into trying to create a different Jesus. Again, you can't persecute people and then have a mystical vision of somebody. And I don't believe in visions. I don't. I don't think Paul had a vision. And there's no way to prove that he did have a vision. So relying on him is a mistake in scholarship. You're relying heavily on Paul. You can't trust what Paul is doing. There's just no way.
I really don't need Paul at my point anyway. My skepticism is all the same. You still have people running around saying that they believe in Jesus. Paul's arguing with them for how they believe in Jesus and talks about other Christs and whatever. I'm like, it still doesn't prove a damnatio Gomorrhae. And in the canonical edition, it talks about the 500 men. Now, it's there. My point that I made earlier is that you have other people that believe that they had seen visions of Jesus, and not a physical Jesus they came in contact with. Again, how did Paul convert? According to him, he claimed. I'm not claiming that the vision happened. I have to remind you that I'm not claiming it happened. I'm claiming that he claims it happened. That he was taken up into the third heaven, and that's how he came across something divine, something connected to Jesus and God in some way, and that's how he converted. He never met the physical Jesus. He never says that he met Jesus.
Right.
And the other people that he encounters don't claim that Jesus is still alive. So
they do. They ate with him. They had,
Yeah, when he was alive in the past, before he died. Yeah.
Well, no. Afterwards, Thomas stuck a finger in the spear wound.
Oh, we're going back to the Gospels now.
Okay. Well, why wouldn't we?
Yeah. So because here's the thing. Yeah, the Gospels claim that Jesus rose from the dead. Right. They claim that. Again, that's the claim. I don't think he rose from the dead, and I'm not convinced of the swoon either. And when we look at the Gospel of Thomas, there's no discussion of a crucifixion in there at all. And James is named as the successor to Jesus, so because the followers of Jesus asked him, "Hey, who's going to succeed you whenever you die?" And he responds, "Look to James." Paraphrasing, but that's basically what it says. Now, I recommend the work of Elaine Pagels. Elaine Pagels has an argument that the Gospel of John knows about the Gospel of Thomas. Now, when you look at how she compares Thomas to John, and Thomas, everybody has the light within them, and then in John, only Jesus is the light. Everybody can find their own way to God in Thomas, and John, only Jesus is the way to God. So that's just a couple of very brief examples that I can give about how John and Thomas' Gospels oppose one another. The Gospels call him the doubting Thomas. At least that's what you see in John. The doubting Thomas. He doubted it. So, why did he doubt it? Why did he doubt it?
For the same reason you are.
The point...
You don't believe that somebody could live through a crucifixion.
They're claiming that he rose from the dead, not survived the crucifixion.
Well, yeah. Yes. Exactly.
Let's keep on track with that. They're not claiming he survived the cross. They're claiming something else entirely. That he rose from the dead. He was buried. He was about to decompose, and all of a sudden he rises from the dead. And you see
Where did that come in?
No, I'm saying he was going to start, and when you die, you're going to eventually start the process of decomposing. That's all I was trying to say. But
Ah.
okay, doesn't matter. What I'm trying to say is, you look at Lazarus, for instance, and now in the Gospel of John, it does put emphasis on how he was rotting and a stinking, something like that, and yet he rises from the dead. He didn't survive anything. That's another point I'm trying to make, is that the Gospels are trying to get us believe in magical resurrection stories. That just like we see in Greco-Roman myth, Sumerian myth, Egyptian, Babylonian, I don't care, but the Celtic religion, whatever religion, Norse, whatever religion you want to compare it to. That's what they do. They're borrowing motifs from other cultures. And I would recommend the works of Dennis MacDonald and Robin Faith Walsh as well, when they compare the New Testament to Greco-Roman literature.
I don't have any problem with that at all. I'm telling you
It's a
that
simpler
if
explanation in my
they
view to
plan
explain.
this, if they plan this, if there's a conspiracy to make it seem as if he rises from the dead, they've got the playbooks. They know what needs to be done. They know how these other religions, these mystery religions started, what the main character went through, that some of them, not all of them, some of them rose from the dead. If I'm trying to motivate a population back then to revolt against the Romans, I'm going to pull out all the stops. I'm going to use magic. I'm going to set up a situation where I can actually survive the crucifixion, but I'll appear dead, and I will allow myself to be buried and taken right back out of that tomb with nobody noticing that, and leave the tomb open or whatever, close it up, seal it, doesn't matter. I'm already gone. So when they find an empty tomb, he's been gone. That's the way it works. And if you look up empty box trick in magic, it's the same thing. And if the Jews claim that he's a magician, he could easily have done those things. Easily. And if they have the playbook on what needs to be done, it's not very difficult to mimic it and make it look the way you want it to look. These were very motivated people. Jesus was highly motivated. I suspect after reading the Asenath story that his mother was very motivated. His father was a high priest. He was motivated. The reason that Jesus preached to the poor, and if you had money, you could not join his movement, was because the priesthood and the wealthy people were in the pockets of the Romans. And if you're trying to get rid of the Romans, you're not going to get rid of anybody that is beholding to them for your wealth. So he preached to the poor. I'm not going to change your mind. I know that. And you're not going to change my mind.
Well, David, the timer's been on for almost 90 minutes now. So
Uh-oh. You want to go to bed?
Yeah, I want to move on to see, and conclude and give some concluding thoughts from you and Jacob so we can wrap it up. Yeah, we went 90 minutes straight almost of conversation. So,
and I haven't had dinner yet, so I'm okay with this.
Wow.
Let me look at a couple of questions, a couple of super chats that were asked. All of them are from my fish in a tie. Please ask the guest where Jesus was from 30 to 62.
It would be from 37 to 62. And there would be no record of where he was because he was a wanted man. He was basically a criminal, according to the Romans and the Sanhedrin. So there's no record of where he would have been because he wouldn't have made his presence known. Now, where he was in 66, he was in Jerusalem.
The next super chat. I fish in a tie again. Thank you for your super chat. Talpiot tomb destroys mythicism and swoon theory. JS.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Paul destroys mythicism. Belief in Paul and what he's saying and not understanding the context of where he's at destroys mythicism.
And how I will
The
respond.
Talpiot tomb does. Huh?
Go
Sorry.
ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, I think the Talpiot tomb would contradict David. This is just giving my little bit of response here. I think that you can't have Jesus being the son of Joseph in the ossuary in the Talpiot tomb and be the same person as Jesus, son of Caiaphas, in the other ossuary. So you have to definitely pick your ossuary. It can't be both. That's how I respond to that super chat. Here's another one from I Fish in a Tie again. There's a condor map that shows Arimathea existed, and it means 2 hills, and people are still named Arimathea today. Yeah, I think Liren already brought that up earlier.
Yeah, those are all later. They weren't from the first century. Those claims weren't first century claims. They come later.
And
so does Nazareth. Nazareth is named later. It wasn't mentioned in either the New Testament or the Bible, the Old Testament, as existing in the first century or anywhere before that.
His next super chat has to do with Arimathea, 2 hills, and is where Talpiot tombs are. So that's just a continuation of the previous super chat. S. Mill, thank you for your super chat. How does he relate Revelation to this theory? I think that's a question for you.
Yeah, I don't. I'm unconcerned with anything that was written after the destruction of the temple in 70. I think after that, so much of the culture was upset, torn apart, that at that point, a lot of people had an agenda to create certain things in response to the fact that the tomb had been destroyed. And so they were looking for a new way to approach God since they didn't have the temple. So a lot of the stuff that came after that is just manufactured stuff.
Here's how I respond to that super chat. I think Revelation doesn't help David's case because it definitely tells us there are Christians that thought Jesus was in the sky somewhere in heaven, and he's going to come back one day in the future, in a glorious second coming. So that it shows that they did believe Jesus ascended into heaven, and that one day he's going to come back. There's going to be the Antichrist. There's going to be seven years of horrible things going on, in which the Antichrist rules the world, and then Jesus comes back. Then the 1,000 years happen, and then Satan breaks out of hell, and Jesus and Satan are gonna have their final fight, and that's just.
How does that refute anything that I said?
Well,
do you believe that stuff is going to happen? Do you believe
no,
that
but it shows you that Christians thought that was going to happen. They thought Jesus wasn't on earth.
Because they tried to explain what they tried in their own heads to try to explain what had gone down. There would have been people that thought he was dead on the cross. There were people that saw him afterwards that thought he was alive. There are segments, and it happens today. That's why we have so many different sects of Christianity.
Well, I could easily just say the same thing, and not need to. It's like one doesn't need to go with the swoon theory because they believed Jesus was the Messiah. They thought that he was just going to make things happen. He was going to bring down God's kingdom upon this earth, and he failed. He got nailed to the cross. And they were traumatized by that experience. They wanted to believe that there's no way Jesus died. There's no way he failed. He was going to win, man. He had God behind him. What happened, man? And so the resurrection gave them hope that one day Jesus is going to come back and he's really going to win. He's going to win, man. It's not over with the cross. We're just getting started. So I don't need for Jesus to survive to explain that. And just because I reject the swoon doesn't mean I believe all this other fantastical nonsense that you see in the New Testament. I don't need to be a Christian to reject the swoon theory, because the way you're putting it's kind of coming off. I have two choices: accept the swoon theory or be a Christian. I'm like, what?
No.
Well, it kind of came off that way.
No, God, no. I don't know how you came to that conclusion, but that's not what I'm trying to indicate. I'm trying to indicate that it was possible, it was humanly possible to do what he did and look as if he died and yet survived. And he was seen in the flesh by other people, and you would have to explain that with your theory. I know your theory from what you said is that he died on the cross and he was buried in a criminal's grave, in a mass pit grave. That doesn't explain the post-resurrection
I mean,
sightings.
I do think he was entombed, but I think he just stayed in there. You know, he never.
He was a corpse and he stayed in there.
Yeah, I don't think he. At least he didn't survive one way or the other. I'm just gonna put.
Then
that
how
down.
do you explain the post-resurrection sightings?
They claimed to have visions. They were desperate. They were desperate for Jesus to not be a failure, to not remain dead. They wanted him to live.
Yeah, but
That's how I explain it.
they didn't all have visions. Okay, they felt that they had seen him on the road to Emmaus.
Seen by
Seen
who?
him
Like
in
physical.
Pentecost.
Well, how
Well,
do you know all those were physical sightings? How do you know that? How do you know these were physical sightings?
Nobody's saying,
Other
hey,
people claim to see.
we met him on the road.
Other people
and it
claim
was
to
just
see
a
risen
vision.
figures in the ancient world too, not just with
Okay.
Jesus.
If
Let's not forget that.
If Paul is saying he had a vision, don't you think these other people would say, hey, we had a vision of Jesus? I mean, it seems to be, okay to have visions. Paul said it. You don't think they would have come out and said, yeah, we just had a vision of Jesus? Don't think so. Anyway, we got to get out of here because Sean is like overdone.
Yeah.
I'm fighting a cold. I mean, I'm just keeping it real.
No, you need to.
Fighting a
I
cold.
do too.
Well,
I don't need a closing statement because almost everything.
we kind of gave our closing statements, even though it took a little longer. Yeah. It's okay. Well, thank you for debating me today, David. I know it got a little tense here and there, but I think it was also fun too, at least in a way.
Oh yeah.
So
Oh yeah.
it's okay. It happens like this. It's nothing personal.
Yeah.
No.
No.
I just want to make that clear to
Yeah.
everybody. Let's not get any of it twisted. It's just
I
part
don't
of the way
think
it
it was
goes.
tense. I don't think it was tense. I think we were both intense about our positions. We felt strongly about our positions, and that's fine. That's what these debates are for. To air
I had
these.
fun.
Yeah. There you
It
go.
was good.
Hey, Lyran had
It
fun.
was definitely good.
Okay.
Did you have fun?
yeah, I did.
Good. Hey,
Yeah, I was
still friends.
definitely entertained.
Good. That's the point. Get people to maybe see things in a different way than they're used to seeing.
So I'll have
Yeah.
the link to the Open
other-
Tomb, the Paul's Literary Metamorphosis, and the Patristica YouTube channels in the YouTube channel in the chat, in the description below, and